On the night of October 11, 1987, 10 armed men stepped into the darkness of the Cumberland Mountains, carrying hunting rifles and a shared understanding that before sunrise, blood would flow through the hollers of Harlan County, Kentucky. By dawn, 14 people lay dead across 12 square miles of Appalachian wilderness, all eliminated with calculated precision by a family that had decided mountain justice mattered more than federal law. This wasn't gang warfare, this wasn't organized crime, this was something far more chilling, a systematic elimination carried out by the Turner clan, a father and his sons and nephews, moving through terrain they'd known since childhood like a military unit executing a carefully planned operation. The Kentucky State Police would later call it the most methodical mass killing in Appalachian history. But what could drive ordinary men, coal miners and mechanics, fathers and sons, to hunt down 14 neighbors like animals in the night? The answer lies not in drugs or territory or generational feuds, but in something as simple and devastating as a $15,000 copper moonshine still that vanished into the October darkness, and one man's unshakable belief that theft of livelihood was a capital offense. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events that tore apart two families and left an entire community scarred forever. Harlan County, Kentucky sprawled across 467 square miles of some of the most unforgiving terrain in the eastern United States. In 1987, the Cumberland Mountains rose like ancient walls, their peaks reaching over 4,000 feet, their valleys so narrow and deep that sunlight only touched the bottom for a few precious hours each day. This was coal country, or had been, until the industry that had sustained these mountains for nearly a century began its death spiral. Population stood around 33,000, down from 75,000 in the boom years of the 1950s when coal was king and every hollow echoed with the sound of mining equipment and the voices of men heading underground before dawn. The county seat, also called Harlan, held barely 2,000 souls who knew each other's business, each other's secrets, and each other's grudges going back decades through bloodlines that stretched into the mists of Appalachian history. October in these mountains meant temperatures dropping to the low 40s at night, creeping up to maybe 60 by mid-afternoon if you were lucky enough to live in a hollow that caught the sun. The air carried the smell of wood smoke from coal stoves and fireplaces, mixed with the sweet rot of fallen leaves and that metallic tang of mountain streams running cold over limestone that had been laid down when this land was covered by ancient seas. At night, when fog rolled down from the ridges like ghostly fingers, you could hear owls calling across the hollers and the distant barking of dogs chained outside trailers and cabins scattered through the hills like seeds thrown by some careless giant. Sound traveled strange in those mountains. Sometimes you'd hear a truck engine 2 miles away, clear as a bell. Other times you wouldn't hear a man walking 10 feet behind you until his boots snapped a twig. But 1987 was a devastating year for coal country. The mining industry that had sustained Harlan County was in free fall. Mines that had employed thousands now sat abandoned, their entrances sealed with concrete, their machinery rusting in the rain like the bones of dead dinosaurs. Unemployment hovered around 40%. Men who'd spent their entire adult lives underground, breathing coal dust and risking cave-ins and explosions for union wages, now had nothing. No jobs, no prospects, no way to feed their families except disability checks that barely covered rent and food stamps that bought humiliation at the checkout counter along with groceries. The company stores that had once extended credit were shuttered. The banks that had once loaned money based on steady mining wages now foreclosed on homes and farms with ruthless efficiency. In that economic wasteland, some families turned to the oldest Appalachian tradition outside of feuding and church-going: moonshine. Not the romantic grandfather's recipe stuff from folk songs and Hollywood movies. This was business. Illegal distilling that could bring in more cash in 3 months than a year of legitimate work, if you had the equipment, the know-how, and the guts to risk federal prison. The mountains provided everything needed for the trade. Hidden hollows where law enforcement rarely ventured, cold spring water for the mash, and a network of back roads known only to locals who'd grown up walking these ridges and could navigate them blindfolded in the dead of night. The sheriff's department was understaffed and underfunded. State police barracks sat 40 miles away in Middlesboro. FBI presence was theoretical at best, a distant threat that most locals figured would never bother with small-time operations in forgotten counties. In Harlan County, the law was more suggestion than reality, and everyone knew it. Daniel Robert Turner was 54 years old that October, though he looked closer to 65. Standing 6 feet 1 inch, but stooped forward from 3 decades spent hunched in coal seams barely 4 feet high, he moved through the world like a man carrying invisible weight. His hands were huge, knuckles swollen with arthritis, fingers permanently stained black from coal dust that no amount of scrubbing could ever completely remove. A thick scar ran from his left ear down to his collarbone, a souvenir from a roof collapse in 1971 that killed 2 men standing right beside him. He walked with a slight limp, legacy of the same accident, and when the weather turned cold, that limp became pronounced enough that his youngest son had to help him up the porch steps of the house he'd called home for more than 30 years. Every morning without fail, Daniel woke at 5:30, made coffee in a percolator so old the bottom was worn thin, and sat at his kitchen table reading from a King James Bible his mother had given him in 1953. He'd read 1 chapter, drink his coffee black and strong enough to wake the dead, then step outside to watch the sun come up over Black Mountain. He'd smoke 1 cigarette, unfiltered Pall Mall rolled so tight it lasted 15 minutes, and then he'd start his day. Check the still hidden 2 miles up Mountain Fork, test the mash, monitor the temperature, collect the shine, and transfer it to mason jars that would be sold to distributors as far away as Lexington and Cincinnati. This was Daniel's routine, his religion, his economic lifeline in a world that had taken everything else from him. He'd married Martha Jean Howard in 1955, right after his discharge from the Army, where he'd learned skills he'd hoped never to use again. They had 6 sons together, James, Robert, Michael, David, Thomas, and William, ranging in age from 32 down to 19. Martha was 53 now, a thin woman whose face had been worn smooth by worry, like a river stone polished by decades of current flowing over it. She'd buried 2 of her own brothers in mining accidents, watched the town she grew up in slowly die like a patient with a wasting disease, and now lived with the daily knowledge that her husband and sons were 1 informant or 1 unlucky breakaway from federal prison. The stress had aged her beyond her years, carved lines around her eyes that hadn't been there when the mines were running and money was steady. What Daniel valued most wasn't the money from Moonshine, though God knew they needed every penny with 6 adult children to feed and no legitimate income to speak of. What he valued was the idea that a man could still make his own way in the world without bowing to government regulations, bank loans, or corporate bosses who'd never set foot in these mountains but made decisions that destroyed entire communities with the stroke of a pen. His grandfather had made shine during Prohibition when it was practically a patriotic duty. His father had made it during the Depression when it was the difference between eating and starving. Daniel saw it as inheritance, tradition, survival, all rolled into the smell of fermenting corn mash and the clear, burning liquid that came out of the copper coils, dropped by precious drop into waiting jars. The still itself had cost him $15,000, assembled piece by piece over 2 years of careful saving and planning. That copper represented everything to Daniel Turner. His family's future, his independence, his defiance of a world that had systematically stripped away every other means of dignified survival. It was beautiful in its simplicity, a 300-gallon capacity masterpiece of mountain engineering that could produce liquid gold when operated with the skill and patience Daniel had inherited from generations of Turner men. 4 miles east up near the old Clovertown mining camp, the Garrett family lived in the ruins of what had once been a thriving community. Tommy Lee Garrett was 38 years old, built thick and strong with a red beard he kept trimmed close and hands missing 2 fingers on the right side, lost to a conveyor belt malfunction in 1979. He ran a small mechanics shop out of his garage, fixing trucks and ATVs for cash, no receipts, no taxes, the kind of under-the-table economy that kept mountain families fed when the legitimate world had forgotten they existed. His younger brothers Wayne, Bobby, Carl, Marcus, and Kevin all worked odd jobs when they could find them, scraped by on unemployment when they couldn't, and survived in the ruins of coal country's collapse just like everyone else in Harlan County. These weren't criminals by nature, weren't cartel members or organized gangsters plotting elaborate schemes in smoke-filled back rooms. They were men who'd grown up in the same hollows, attended the same schools, worked in the same mines until the mines shut down and left them stranded in an economic wasteland with skills no one needed anymore. Tommy Garrett's wife, Susan, had been 3 years behind Martha Turner in high school. Bobby Garrett and Michael Turner had played basketball together on teams that hadn't won many games, but had given their communities something to cheer about during the long, dark winters when coal prices were down and families struggled to heat their homes. Their families had never been close friends. 4 miles of mountain terrain and different church affiliations kept most families isolated in their own small worlds, but they weren't enemies either, just neighbors in the Appalachian sense, aware of each other's existence, occasionally crossing paths at the hardware store or the post office. Tommy's father had done some shine work back in the 60s, got busted by federal agents, and served 18 months in federal prison, a sentence that had taught the family to steer clear of the moonshine business. Tommy had sworn he'd never touch the trade, told his wife and brothers that the risk was too great, the penalties too severe, but times were desperate in October of 1987. His oldest son needed braces they couldn't afford on a mechanic's irregular income. His daughter wanted to go to community college, had the grades and the dreams, but not the money for tuition. When you're watching your family slip deeper into poverty every month, watching your children's futures disappear because you can't provide what other families take for granted, principles start to feel like luxuries you simply can't afford. The bills don't care about your moral stance on illegal activities. The bank doesn't care that you've always been an honest man when the mortgage payment is 3 months overdue and foreclosure notices arrive in your mailbox like death sentences printed on official letterhead. That's where the copper still came in, gleaming like salvation in the darkness of economic despair. Word traveled through Harlan County like water running downhill, following the path of least resistance through family connections and church pews and conversations at the gas station. Everyone knew who had money, who had equipment, who might be persuaded to part with either for the right price. The Turner still was legendary among those who knew such things existed, a custom-built masterpiece worth every penny of the $15,000 Daniel had invested in its construction. To someone like Tommy Garrett, that still represented more than equipment. It represented a way out, a chance to escape the grinding poverty that threatened to consume his family's future. Sell it to buyers in Cincinnati or Louisville, take the cash, maybe move the family to Lexington or Knoxville where jobs still existed and children could attend schools that hadn't been gutted by budget cuts and economic collapse. The still disappeared on the night of October 9, 1987. Daniel Turner had checked it at sunset, walking the familiar trail through forest he could navigate blindfolded, finding everything normal and secure. The mash was fermenting properly, the temperature was holding steady, the operation was running exactly as it had for the past 2 years. When he returned at dawn on October 10th, the clearing was empty. Not just the still itself, but everything. The copper coils that had taken months to acquire and install properly, the burner that provided precise temperature control, the thermometer that monitored the delicate process of distillation, the collection jars that held liquid worth more than gold in these mountains. Every single piece of equipment that represented 2 years of work and $15,000 in investment had vanished like it had never existed, leaving only a rectangular patch of flattened grass where Daniel's future had stood. Daniel Turner stood in that empty clearing for 20 minutes, just staring at the space where his livelihood had been, breathing shallow and fast while his hands opened and closed at his sides like he was trying to grasp something that was no longer there. The violation went deeper than simple theft. This was the destruction of everything he'd built to keep his family afloat in a world that had systematically eliminated every other option for survival. When he finally walked back down the mountain to his truck, his mind had already made the calculations that would lead to 14 deaths. There were only 3 families in Harlan County who knew the location of that still, only 3 families who had the trucks and manpower to move 300 pounds of equipment through dense forest in the middle of the night without being detected by neighbors or law enforcement. And one of those families, the Garretts, had been asking questions about copper prices at the scrapyard in Middlesboro 2 weeks earlier. Casual inquiries that had seemed innocent at the time but now took on sinister significance in light of the theft that had just destroyed Daniel's world. On October 10th at 2 in the afternoon, Daniel Turner drove his 1979 Ford pickup into the parking lot of Tommy Garrett's mechanic shop. The autumn air was crisp and clear, leaves beginning their annual transformation from green to gold and red, the kind of day that should have filled a man with appreciation for the beauty of his mountain home. Instead, Daniel felt only cold purpose settling over him like armor he'd worn before in darker times and distant places. Tommy was under a Chevy truck, legs sticking out, impact wrench screaming as he worked to remove a stubborn bolt. Daniel waited without calling out, standing beside the toolbox with the patience of a man who'd learned in war that haste gets you killed and planning keeps you alive. Finally, Tommy rolled out on his creeper board, wiping his hands on a rag, and saw Boots standing beside his workspace. The conversation that followed would be recounted by 3 witnesses in court testimony that helped seal the fate of 10 men. Daniel's voice was flat and empty when he spoke, drained of emotion but carrying an undertone of threat that made Tommy Garrett's blood run cold despite the October warmth. "My still disappeared last night," Daniel said, each word precise and measured. "Figure you might know something about that." Tommy's face showed nothing, 38 years in Harlan County having taught him how to keep his reactions internal when danger presented itself wearing familiar faces. "That's unfortunate, but I don't know nothing about your business, Daniel." "I'm giving you until 4 o'clock tomorrow," Daniel continued, his voice never rising above conversational level, but somehow more terrifying for its calmness. "Sundown on October 11th. Return what's mine, and we forget this happened. Don't return it." He let the sentence hang in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Tommy straightened up, 6 inches shorter than Daniel but wider through the shoulders, hands still holding the rag he'd been using to clean grease from his fingers. "You threatening me?" "I'm giving you fair warning," Daniel replied, turning to walk back to his truck. "Mountain rules. You know them same as me. Man steals another man's livelihood, that debt gets settled." The ultimatum spread through Harlan County within hours, carried by the same informal network that had spread news of copper prices and missing stills. By sunset, everyone in a 20-mile radius knew that Daniel Turner and the Garrett family were headed for trouble, but people had been predicting feuds and violence in these mountains for generations. Most of the time, it was just talk, men posturing and making threats they never intended to follow through on. Most of the time, cooler heads prevailed and disputes were settled with handshakes and grudging respect rather than gunfire. Most of the time, the mountain code of honor stopped short of actual bloodshed, but not always. And October of 1987 would prove to be one of those times when words weren't enough, when pride and desperation and the ancient codes that governed mountain justice would demand a reckoning that would stain these hills with blood for generations to come. Generations to come. The deadline came and went like a stone dropping into dark water. October 11th, 4 in the afternoon. Daniel Turner stood on his front porch, watching the sun sink behind Little Black Mountain, and the copper still remained gone. No truck pulled up his driveway carrying apologetic Garrett brothers. No phone call came with explanations or negotiations. No messenger appeared to make things right according to the mountain code that had governed these disputes for generations. Just silence, and the slow understanding that Tommy Garrett had made his choice. Martha appeared in the doorway behind him, drying her hands on a dish towel worn thin from decades of use. "Maybe they don't have it, Daniel." "Maybe you're wrong about who took it." Daniel didn't turn around, his eyes fixed on the darkening ridgeline where shadows gathered like conspirators planning mischief. "I'm not wrong. Then call the sheriff. Let the law handle this like civilized people." "Sheriff's 40 miles away," Daniel said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom about how justice worked in forgotten places like Harlan County. "By the time he drives out here, takes statements, files paperwork if he even bothers, that still will be melted down and sold for scrap in Cincinnati or Louisville." He finally looked at her, this woman who'd stood by him through 3 decades of marriage, through mining accidents and economic collapse, and all the small defeats that accumulate over a lifetime spent fighting for survival in an unforgiving landscape. "Besides, you know how this works, Martha. Mountain handles mountain business." Martha's face went pale as understanding dawned. She knew what that phrase meant, what it had always meant in these hills where government authority was distant and unreliable, where families settled their own scores according to codes older than any law written in Frankfurt or Washington. "Daniel, please think about the boys." "I am thinking about the boys," he replied, his voice gaining an edge that made her step backward despite herself. What kind of man lets someone steal $15,000 from his family and does nothing? What kind of father teaches his sons that you can be robbed and just accept it like a whipped dog? He turned back to watch the sunset, the conversation effectively ended by his tone and posture. I gave fair warning, rest is on them. Martha went back inside, and Daniel heard her crying in the kitchen but didn't follow. Some decisions you make alone, carrying the weight without asking others to share the burden. Some choices strip away everything civilized about a man until only the ancient codes remain, demanding satisfaction regardless of consequences. 3 days earlier, on the Thursday before everything fell apart, Daniel had driven into town with his youngest son, William. They'd gone to the hardware store for fence staples, stopped at the post office to mail Martha's sister a birthday card, grabbed lunch at the diner on Main Street where the ceiling fan wobbled and the coffee was always too weak. Normal things, father and son running errands like they'd done hundreds of times before. William was 19, still young enough to believe the future held something better than Harlan County's slow collapse into economic irrelevance. He'd been talking about joining the Army, not because he wanted to see the world or serve his country, but because it represented the only ladder he could see leading up from the pit their community had become. Military recruiters promised training, steady pay, college money afterward, a chance to build something resembling a middle-class life. They sat in a booth at the back of the diner, red vinyl cracked and patched with duct tape, ceiling fan creating more noise than actual air movement. The place smelled like fried grease and weak coffee and the accumulated disappointments of a community watching its dreams die one closed business at a time. William ordered a cheeseburger and fries with the enthusiasm of someone who still believed tomorrow would be better than today. Daniel got the meatloaf special, same thing he'd ordered every Thursday for the past 5 years. "Dad, you think I should go ahead and sign up?" William asked, pouring ketchup on his fries with the careful concentration of youth approaching a major life decision. "I mean, with the Army?" Daniel chewed slowly, thinking about the question and all its implications. Outside the window, Main Street sat mostly empty despite the lunch hour. Half the storefronts were boarded up with plywood that had weathered gray. The movie theater had closed 2 years back when the owner couldn't afford to keep showing films to audiences of 12 or 15 people. Even the bank had reduced its hours to 3 days a week because there wasn't enough business to justify staying open full time. "I think," Daniel said finally, meeting his son's eyes across the table, "a man does what he has to do to take care of himself and his family. If the Army gives you a future that these mountains can't provide, then yeah, you should go." He reached across the table and squeezed William's shoulder, feeling the solid muscle of a young man who'd grown up strong despite everything their world had thrown at him. "But you remember where you come from. Remember what matters. Family, honor, keeping your word. Don't let them strip that out of you in basic training or wherever they send you after." William nodded, serious and solemn in the way 19-year-olds get when discussing their futures with fathers they respect. "I won't, Dad. I promise." Daniel smiled, one of the last genuine smiles he'd share with his youngest son before everything changed. "You're a good boy, Will, going to make something of yourself no matter where you end up." That was Thursday afternoon, when the world still made sense and families could sit in diners making plans for futures that seemed achievable with enough work and determination. On Sunday, Daniel discovered the still was gone. On Monday, he confronted Tommy Garrett. And now, Thursday evening, William would be helping load rifles into the back of his father's truck, his future in the Army evaporating before it even began like morning mist burned away by an unforgiving sun. The preparation started Friday morning when Daniel woke before dawn and drove to his brother-in-law's place 12 miles away up near Evarts. Frank Howard was 62, retired from the mines with black lungs so severe he could barely climb a flight of stairs without stopping to rest. But he still maintained an impressive gun collection accumulated over decades of hunting these mountains and preparing for troubles that might never come. Frank sat on his porch despite the early hour, oxygen tank beside his chair like a faithful dog, breathing through clear plastic tubes that snaked around his ears and into his nostrils. The sound of his damaged lungs working overtime filled the morning silence, a constant reminder of what 30 years underground had cost him. "Daniel, awful early for visiting. Frank wheezed, looking up from the newspaper he'd been pretending to read while actually watching the road for whatever had brought his brother-in-law to his door before the sun was properly up. "Need to borrow some hardware, Frank." The old man's eyes narrowed with understanding born from decades of mountain living. He'd survived long enough to recognize the tone in Daniel's voice, the particular quality that meant violence was coming whether anyone wanted it or not. "This about that still somebody took from you?" "Garrett family stole from me. I gave them a chance to make it right. They chose wrong." Frank was quiet for a long time, wheezing through his damaged lungs while he considered the implications of what Daniel was asking. Finally, he struggled to his feet and shuffled inside without another word, returning 10 minutes later with 2 rifles wrapped in old blankets. "Remington 700 in .30-06 and a Marlin lever action in .308, Frank said, unwrapping the weapons with the careful reverence mountain men reserved for quality firearms. "These are yours to keep, Daniel. Consider them an early Christmas present." He gripped Daniel's arm with surprising strength for a man whose lungs were slowly killing him. "But listen to me, boy. You do this thing you're planning, there's no coming back from it. You understand that? Your sons will go to prison. You'll die in prison. Martha will be alone with nothing but memories and regrets." "I understand. The Garrett boys should have returned that equipment. Any fool knows you don't steal a man's livelihood and expect to walk away clean. But Daniel..." Frank's voice trailed off as he searched for words that might turn his brother-in-law away from the path he'd chosen. "I know all the arguments, Frank. I've heard them from Martha, heard them in my own head every night since that still disappeared. But some things matter more than staying out of prison. Some things matter more than dying comfortable in your own bed." Frank let go of Daniel's arm and shook his head sadly. "Lord help us all." Over the next 3 days, Daniel quietly assembled an arsenal that would have impressed a small military unit. His own deer rifle, a Winchester Model 70 in .30-06 that had belonged to his father before him. James had a Remington 870 shotgun in 12 gauge that he'd bought for duck hunting but had never actually used for anything more threatening than clay pigeons. Robert owned a .357 Magnum revolver he'd purchased at a pawn shop in Middlesbrough during flush times when he'd had money to spend on luxuries like handguns. Michael had inherited their grandfather's Springfield .30-06 from World War II, a rifle that had seen action in the Pacific Theater and still shot straight as the day it rolled off the assembly line in 1943. The nephews Lucas, Frank Jr., Henry, and Samuel all had hunting weapons accumulated over years of deer seasons and target practice, the kind of firearms collection that was as common in Appalachian households as indoor plumbing and electric lights. Daniel didn't need to buy anything new for the operation he was planning. This was rural Kentucky, where gun ownership wasn't a political statement but a practical necessity for men who hunted their own meat and lived too far from law enforcement to rely on anyone but themselves for protection. But he did buy ammunition, and he bought it carefully. 3 boxes of .30-06, 2 boxes of .308, 4 boxes of 12-gauge buckshot, and 50 rounds of .357 Magnum. He spread the purchases across 4 different stores to avoid attracting attention. 1 in Harlan, 1 in Cumberland, 1 in Middlesbrough, 1 in Pineville. Paid cash everywhere, kept the receipts in a coffee can under the kitchen sink because some part of him still believed in documentation, in proving he'd done everything legally right up until the moment he crossed the line into darkness. Wednesday afternoon found Daniel spread topographic maps across his kitchen table, the same maps the Forest Service used to mark trails and campsites for the occasional tourists brave enough to venture into the deeper hollows. He'd been walking these mountains since he was 5 years old, knew them in daylight and darkness and every season in between, but planning an operation like this required precision beyond mere familiarity. He marked the Garrett compound with a red X, marked the escape routes with yellow highlighter, marked where each of his men would position themselves with blue circles that looked innocent enough but represented kill zones calculated with military precision. James stood beside him studying the maps like a student preparing for the most important exam of his life. "This is military, Dad. Like Vietnam all over again." "Vietnam taught me how to stay alive when people were trying to kill me," Daniel replied without looking up from the maps. "Taught me patience. Taught me that emotion gets you caught, but planning gets you home to your family." He tapped the map with one thick finger, indicating the Garrett property. "We do this right. Nobody gets hurt that doesn't deserve it. And if they have weapons, if they fight back. Daniel looked at his oldest son, seeing in James's face the same mixture of determination and fear he'd carried himself during those long nights in Southeast Asian jungles when death could come from any direction without warning. Then we fight harder and better than they do because we're fighting for family and they're fighting for stolen property, and family always wins when the stakes are this high. At that exact moment, while Daniel Turner and his sons planned systematic murder in their kitchen, Tommy Garrett was working late in his garage replacing a transmission on a Ford Ranger, completely unaware that 10 men had decided he and his entire family were marked for elimination. The impact wrench screamed its familiar song, classic rock played on a paint-splattered radio that had been his father's before him. His youngest daughter brought him a ham sandwich around 7, kissed his greasy forehead and told him not to work too late. Normal Wednesday evening, normal family life, normal conversations about whether he could finish the transmission job by Friday and collect the $80 that would help pay this month's electric bill. Tommy Garrett went to bed that night thinking about automotive repair and family finances and whether his oldest son's grades were good enough for a college scholarship. He didn't think about Daniel Turner at all. Thursday evening found Daniel sitting alone in his barn, the building heavy with the smell of motor oil, old hay, and 30 years of accumulated dust. A single work light hung from a beam overhead, casting long shadows that danced across the walls like specters of things to come. On the workbench before him lay his Winchester Model 70, disassembled for cleaning with the methodical care of a man who understood that attention to detail meant the difference between success and catastrophe. His hands moved automatically through the familiar ritual: bore brush, cleaning rod, solvent, patches. He'd cleaned this rifle thousands of times over the decades, knew every scratch in the walnut stock, every wear mark on the blued barrel. His father had used this weapon to hunt deer every November from 1952 until cancer took him in 1981. Daniel had inherited it along with the family's understanding that some tools were sacred, that a man's rifle was an extension of his will and his responsibility to protect what mattered most. Now he was preparing to use it for something his father had never imagined, something that would transform a hunting rifle into an instrument of vengeance that would echo through these mountains for generations. He thought about federal prison, about life sentences, about dying behind concrete walls instead of under open skies. They'd charge him with murder, multiple counts, premeditated and planned with malice aforethought. Life without parole if he was fortunate. The death penalty if prosecutors decided to make an example of mountain justice gone too far. He was 54 years old. Even if they gave him life instead of the needle, he'd die in a cell somewhere, never again seeing Martha except through reinforced glass during visiting hours that would become fewer and farther between as the years ground on. Never seeing grandchildren when they eventually came, never walking these ridges at dawn, breathing cold air that smelled like pine needles and creek water, and the promise of snow before Thanksgiving. All of that sacrificed for copper, for $15,000, for the principle that a man doesn't let himself be robbed without consequences. He could stop, could call Tommy Garrett right now, tonight, say forget the whole thing, let bygones be bygones like civilized people do, could drive to Middlesboro tomorrow morning, talk to the sheriff, file a proper report with serial numbers and descriptions, let the law handle it the way Martha wanted, the way his youngest son William hoped, the way decent society expected men to behave when wronged by neighbors. It might take months, might not go anywhere at all. Federal agents had bigger concerns than moonshine stills in forgotten counties where unemployment ran 40% and hope was rarer than honest work. But at least he'd stay free, stay home, stay human. But then he thought about standing in that empty clearing, staring at the rectangular patch of flattened grass where his future had been. Thought about 2 years of careful work vanishing in one night of theft. Thought about Tommy Garrett's face when confronted, the casual lie delivered without shame or regret. Like Daniel's livelihood meant nothing more than pocket change dropped between couch cushions. Thought about his sons watching, learning what their father did when someone crossed him, when someone stole the foundation from under his family's feet and laughed while doing it. No. Some things mattered more than freedom, more than life itself. Honor, respect. The lesson that actions had consequences, that theft carried a price, That mountain families didn't roll over and accept robbery like beaten dogs grateful for any scraps thrown their way. Daniel reassembled the rifle with practiced efficiency, loaded 5 rounds into the magazine, and set it aside with the reverence of a priest preparing communion. Then he started on James's shotgun, 12-gauge Remington that would speak with authority when the time came for conversation to end and judgment to begin. There was no turning back now. The decision had crystallized like ice forming on a mountain pond, transparent and hard and beautiful in its terrible simplicity. Friday night brought the family together one last time. Daniel's sons and nephews gathered at the house while Martha cooked dinner with extra care, preparing the kind of meal she made for special occasions. Fried chicken golden and crispy, mashed potatoes whipped with butter and cream, green beans from her garden that she'd canned in August when the world still made sense, biscuits hot from the oven with honey butter that melted into golden pools of sweetness. Nobody talked about why they were all there. Nobody mentioned the rifles being cleaned in the barn, the ammunition boxes stacked on the workbench, the topographic maps spread across Daniel's truck seat with red X's and blue circles marking locations where men would die. They ate like normal families do, talked about everyday things that seemed important when death wasn't sitting at the table like an uninvited guest. William mentioned a girl he'd met at the gas station, someone pretty with kind eyes who'd smiled when he'd helped her check her oil. Robert talked about finally getting his carburetor adjusted properly after weeks of rough idling. Michael complained about the weather turning cold so early, his arthritis already acting up, though winter was still months away. Family dinner, last supper, the final gathering of men who would scatter like leaves in a storm, some to prison, some to graves, all of them changed forever by what tomorrow night would bring. After the meal, Daniel stood slowly, joints protesting the movement. His voice carried the weight of finality when he spoke, the tone of a commanding officer giving orders that would not be questioned or debated. Boys, nephews, go on home now. Get some rest. Tomorrow night we handle our business. They all understood what that meant. Nobody asked questions about timing or targets or rules of engagement. Nobody suggested alternatives or voiced second thoughts about crossing lines that decent men weren't supposed to cross. They'd been raised in these mountains, taught the old codes that governed how disputes were settled when law enforcement was 40 miles away, and justice was something you provided for yourself. When someone steals from you, you settle the debt. When someone disrespects your family, you answer with interest. The specifics might vary, but the principle remained constant as the mountains themselves. One by one they left, engines starting in the darkness, taillights disappearing down the winding driveway that would soon carry them back for the last time as free men. James was the final one to go, standing on the porch with keys in hand, looking back at his father with eyes that held questions he couldn't bring himself to ask. Dad, you absolutely certain about this? We could still... James, go home. Kiss your wife. Hold your children. Tell them you love them without explaining why it's important they remember. James nodded slowly, understanding flooding his face like sunrise over the mountains. He got in his truck, drove away into the October night, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts and his choices and the terrible mathematics of mountain justice. Daniel stood on that porch for the better part of an hour, smoking cigarettes and watching stars emerge one by one in the clear mountain sky. Temperature had dropped to 42 degrees. His breath made small clouds in the air that dissipated quickly, like prayers offered to an indifferent heaven. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howled with the lonesome sound that mountain people knew meant change coming, weather or trouble or death approaching on silent feet. The mountains around him held their eternal silence, keeping secrets that stretched back centuries to the first settlers who'd carved homesteads from wilderness and established the codes that still governed how men settled their differences when civilization proved inadequate to the task. Martha came outside wrapped in the cardigan sweater she'd worn to church last Sunday, back when the world still held the possibility of peaceful resolutions and Christian forgiveness. She didn't say anything at first, just stood beside him sharing the cold night air and the weight of what tomorrow would bring. After 5 minutes of comfortable silence, she spoke without looking at him. I'll wait for you, Daniel. However long it takes, wherever they send you, I'll wait. I know you will. Promise me something, if I can. Promise me you'll remember what you're fighting for when it starts. Not what you're fighting against, but what you're protecting. Remember that it's about family, about keeping food on the table and a roof over our heads. Don't let it become about anger or revenge or proving something to people who don't matter. Daniel turned to look at his wife of 32 years, her face lined with age and worry, hair gray now instead of the black it had been when they'd married young and hopeful in a world that seemed full of possibilities. She'd stood by him through mining accidents and layoffs, through the slow death of their community, and now through this final choice that would destroy everything they'd built together. He pulled her close, kissed her forehead, breathed in the scent of her lavender soap and the cedar from the chest where she kept her good clothes. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Martha Jean. Whatever comes after tonight, I want you to remember that." She was crying now, tears warm against his shirt. "Please don't go, Daniel. Please don't do this thing. I have to." "No, you don't. You're choosing to. There's a difference." "Same thing," he said quietly. "When a man's choices get narrowed down to this, there's no difference between have to and choose to." At 10:30, Daniel walked through the dark house one final time, checking rooms that held 30 years of memories. He stood in the doorway of William's bedroom, empty tonight because his son was staying with cousin Lucas as part of the plan. Breathed in the smell of young manhood and old baseball gloves and dreams that would die before dawn. He paused at the bedroom he'd shared with Martha since their wedding night, memorizing the way moonlight fell across the quilt her mother had made as a wedding gift. The photographs on the dresser showing their family in happier times. The cedar chest at the foot of the bed where Martha kept letters he'd written from the army before they'd married. This was goodbye to everything civilized, everything decent, everything that connected him to the man he'd been before theft and desperation, and mountain codes demanded blood payment for dishonor. Martha was sitting at the kitchen table when he came downstairs, staring at her hands folded in her lap, like a woman praying for miracles she knew wouldn't come. She didn't look up when he picked up his truck keys, didn't speak when he walked to the door and stood there with his hand on the knob. "Martha, don't..." His voice broke slightly on her name. "Don't say anything else, Daniel. Just go do what you think you have to do." He walked out into the night that would transform him from coal miner and moonshiner into something the newspapers would call a monster. Started his truck, the engine sounding too loud in the mountain silence. He looked back at the house one final time, seeing Martha's silhouette framed in the kitchen window, yellow light spilling out onto the porch where they'd sat together on summer evenings, planning futures that would never come to pass. He raised his hand once, a final gesture of love and farewell. Didn't know if she saw it, didn't wait to find out. Then he drove toward the rendezvous point where 9 other men waited with rifles and the shared understanding that by sunrise, nothing in their world would ever be the same again. The clearing where they met sat 2 miles from the Garrett compound, hidden from the road by stands of white pine and hickory that had grown thick over decades of abandonment. Daniel pulled his truck in beside 9 other vehicles, engines ticking as they cooled in the October night. His sons and nephews stood in the darkness, breath steaming in the cold air, armed and ready for war against neighbors they'd known their entire lives. The fog was already starting to roll down from Black Mountain, thick and cold, turning familiar forest into alien landscape where visibility would be measured in feet rather than yards. Perfect weather for what they'd come to do. Perfect conditions for ghosts to move through darkness, settling debts that law and civilization couldn't balance. Daniel climbed out of his truck, Winchester in hand, and looked at the faces of men who'd followed him this far because family mattered more than law, because mountain justice demanded payment in blood when thieves violated the ancient codes that held their world together. What happened in the next 6 hours would leave 14 people dead, 10 families destroyed, and Harlan County marked forever with the kind of violence that people would whisper about for generations, while children played in hollers where men had once hunted each other like animals in the night. The reckoning was about to begin. At exactly 11:47 on the night of October 11th, 1987, Daniel Turner pulled his Ford pickup into that hidden clearing and shut off the engine. The temperature had dropped to 38 degrees. The moon hung like a sliver of broken glass in the sky, providing just enough light to see shapes moving through trees, but not enough to make out faces clearly. Fog rolled down from the ridgelines in thick waves, turning the familiar forest into something alien and threatening. The silence was absolute, except for wind moving through bare branches and the distant trickle of water over stones somewhere in the darkness. Daniel sat behind the wheel for a long moment, hands resting on the worn steering wheel, looking through his windshield at the Garrett compound visible maybe 400 yards away through the trees. 3 trailers arranged in a rough triangle, a single yellow security light casting long shadows across the clearing. Through one window, the blue flicker of a television screen where a family was settling in for Saturday night, completely unaware that 10 armed men had positioned themselves in the surrounding forest. His breathing came slow and steady. He'd expected his heart to race, expected fear, or maybe even last-minute doubt to flood through him like ice water. Instead, he felt nothing but cold purpose, like he'd already stepped outside himself and was watching Daniel Turner, the killer, from a great distance, observing this transformation with the detached interest of someone studying a stranger's choices. He picked up his Winchester Model 70, opened the chamber, confirmed the round was seated properly, closed it with a quiet metallic click. The rifle felt familiar in his hands, an extension of his will that had fed his family for decades and would now protect their honor in ways his father had never imagined when he'd passed the weapon down to his son. "Dad," James said from the passenger seat, his voice barely above a whisper, "this is the last chance to change our minds." Daniel looked at his oldest son, 32 years old, face already lined from hard mountain living, about to throw away everything decent about his life because his father had decided that honor mattered more than freedom. "We're past that point, son. Been past it since Tuesday when I found that empty clearing." James nodded slowly, understanding that some decisions create their own momentum, carrying men forward into darkness whether they want to go or not. "Then let's finish what we came to do." Daniel opened the door, dome light disabled hours earlier to avoid advertising their presence. 9 other doors opened simultaneously in the darkness. 10 men, armed and silent, moving through fog like shadows cast by a fire that hadn't been lit yet. They'd rehearsed this operation, knew their positions, understood their assignments with the precision of soldiers who'd learned that chaos gets you killed, while discipline gets you home. Daniel and James would take the main trailer where Tommy Garrett lived with his wife and children. Robert and Michael would handle the second trailer. David and Thomas would secure the third. The nephews Lucas, Frank Jr., Henry, and Samuel would form a perimeter around the compound, cutting off escape routes, ensuring that nobody fled into the forest to alert neighbors or law enforcement. Military precision learned in Southeast Asian jungles and adapted for Appalachian hollers where different rules applied, but the stakes remained just as deadly. Tonight, that training would transform coal miners and mechanics into something far more dangerous, something their families wouldn't recognize when morning came and the blood had been shed. They moved through the forest without speaking, using hand signals Daniel remembered from a war fought on the other side of the world 35 years earlier. The temperature continued dropping, making their breath visible in small clouds that dissipated quickly in the mountain air. Daniel's boots crunched softly on frost-covered leaves, each step deliberate and measured. Behind him, James breathed steady and controlled, the sound of a man who'd accepted what was coming and made peace with the consequences. At 11:52, they reached the tree line. The Garrett compound sat in a clearing maybe 50 yards across, the security light buzzing with insects despite the October cold. From the main trailer, Daniel heard the sound of laughter, probably a television sitcom with its canned audience finding humor in situations that bore no resemblance to the reality of Appalachian life. From the second trailer came music, a country station playing something about heartbreak and whiskey. The third trailer sat dark and quiet. Daniel raised his hand, and everyone froze. They waited, listening for sounds that might complicate their mission. Dogs could bark and alert neighbors. Children crying could wake adults who might otherwise sleep through what was about to happen. Unexpected visitors could arrive at the worst possible moment, but the Garrett dogs had been handled earlier, poisoned meat left by the roadside in an act of cruelty that Daniel regretted but couldn't avoid. Dogs barked when strangers approached. Barking brought attention they couldn't afford tonight. This needed to happen fast and quiet, with surgical precision that left no witnesses and no survivors who might identify the men responsible. The moral compromises had begun before the first shot was fired. Daniel lowered his hand, and they crossed that clearing like ghosts materializing from mountain mist. 10 men with rifles, spreading out according to a plan drawn on topographic maps around a kitchen table where families usually shared meals and discussed hopes for better futures. Daniel and James reached the main trailer first, Daniel's hand touching the cold aluminum door that separated him from the point of no return. This was the final moment when he could still change his mind, could wake the Garretts and tell them he'd reconsidered, could walk away without crossing the line that would transform him from victim of theft into perpetrator of mass murder. The door handle felt cold under his palm, metal that conducted the October chill straight through his skin and into his bones. He opened it instead. Tommy Garrett sat on a worn couch in his living room, beer in one hand, remote control in the other, watching what looked like a rerun of some comedy show from earlier in the decade. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt, socks with holes in the toes, the uniform of working men everywhere who'd come home tired and wanted nothing more than cold beer and mindless entertainment. He turned at the sound of the door opening, saw Daniel standing there with the Winchester, and understanding came to his face in stages. Confusion first, as his mind struggled to process why his neighbor would be entering his home uninvited at midnight. Then recognition, as he identified Daniel Turner holding a hunting rifle, like he meant to use it for something other than deer. Finally, fear, as the implications became clear, and Tommy realized that his deadline had passed, his choice had consequences, and mountain justice was about to be served with the kind of finality that legal courts couldn't match. "Daniel, what the hell are you doing in my house?" "You had your chance," Daniel replied, his voice flat and empty of everything human. "Deadline was 4 o'clock this afternoon, sunset 6 hours ago." Tommy started to stand, beer bottle slipping from his fingers to shatter on the linoleum floor. The television kept playing, laugh track finding humor in situations that suddenly seemed obscene, given what was happening in this small trailer where a man was about to die for decisions made in desperation. The Winchester barked once, the sound echoing through the trailer and across the clearing beyond. Tommy fell backward over the couch, arms spread wide, eyes staring at a ceiling he would never see again. The beer foam spread across cheap flooring, mixing with blood that looked black in the artificial light. Daniel heard screaming from the bedroom, Susan Garrett's voice raised in terror and confusion as she tried to understand what the gunshot meant, who was in her home, why her husband wasn't answering when she called his name. James moved toward the hallway, rifle ready, but Daniel grabbed his arm. "Women and children don't count," Daniel said, his voice carrying the weight of moral boundaries that still existed even in this moment of ultimate violation. "That's the line we don't cross." James looked at his father, seeing something in the older man's eyes that might have been the last vestige of humanity clinging to codes older than law. "She saw us, Dad. She can identify us in court." "Women and children," Daniel repeated, and his tone made it clear this wasn't a suggestion but an order that would be followed regardless of tactical considerations. "That's how we stay different from animals." They left Susan Garrett screaming in her bedroom and moved toward the second trailer where Bobby Garrett was about to discover that family loyalty carried a price measured in blood, and that being born with the wrong last name could be a death sentence in mountains where ancient codes still governed how men settled their differences. At exactly 12:03, they found Bobby in his kitchen making a late-night sandwich. Bologna and cheese, mayonnaise and mustard spread across the counter, bread laid out in neat rows like he was preparing multiple sandwiches for children's school lunches. He wore pajama pants and a Harlan County High School t-shirt, 28 years old, father of 2 daughters who slept in the next room, dreaming whatever dreams children have when the world still makes sense and violence exists only in movies and video games. He turned when they entered, saw the rifles, dropped the knife he'd been using to spread mayonnaise. The blade clattered on the floor, a small sound that seemed enormous in the sudden silence that filled the kitchen like poison gas. "Jesus Christ, Daniel, this is insane." "Your brother stole from me," Daniel said, rifle pointed at Bobby's chest. "You stood by and let it happen. That makes you guilty too." Bobby raised his hands, backing toward the sink, eyes darting between Daniel and James like a trapped animal looking for escape routes that didn't exist. "I didn't know nothing about any still, I swear to God. I work at the Ford dealership, fix transmissions, mind my own business." "You're a Garrett. That makes you guilty." "Man, please, I got two little girls sleeping right there." Bobby pointed toward a closed door with desperate hope, like mentioning innocent children might activate some mercy in men who'd already decided that family names determined guilt and punishment. Daniel felt something crack in his chest, a fissure in the cold purpose that had carried him this far. Little girls, innocent as his own grandchildren would someday be, about to lose their father because their uncle had stolen copper from the wrong family. The moral mathematics became complicated when children entered the equation. "You got 30 seconds to say goodbye," Daniel said, his voice rougher now, strained by emotions he'd been suppressing since this operation began. Bobby's face went white as mountain snow. "You can't just murder me in front of my babies." 25 seconds. Bobby stumbled toward the bedroom door, opened it carefully to avoid waking daughters who would have nightmares for the rest of their lives, regardless of whether they witnessed what was about to happen. Daniel heard children's voices, groggy and confused, asking why Daddy was in their room so late. Heard Bobby's voice breaking as he told them he loved them more than all the stars in the sky. Told them to stay in their room no matter what sounds they heard. Told them to be brave like the princesses in their storybooks. The door closed. Bobby came back out, tears streaming down his face, hands shaking like leaves in a storm. "They're babies, Daniel. 5 and 7 years old. You do this. You make them orphans for something they had nothing to do with. Should have thought about that before your family crossed me. I didn't cross nobody. Tommy made his own choices." Daniel's rifle spoke with authority, cutting off Bobby's desperate protests. He fell beside his unfinished sandwich, mayonnaise jar on its side, white cream spreading across the counter like spilled innocence. The refrigerator hummed its familiar tune. From the bedroom, one of the girls started crying, a sound that would haunt Daniel's dreams for whatever years remained to him. They walked out into the fog-shrouded night, leaving behind a kitchen that smelled like lunch meat and death, moving toward the third trailer where more men would die because they'd chosen the wrong family loyalty, in a world where such choices carried permanent consequences. At 12:17, they found Wayne Garrett in the mechanic's garage behind the trailers, working late on a carburetor job he'd hoped to finish before Monday morning. 26 years old, newest father in the Garrett clan, baby daughter just 8 months old and sleeping peacefully in a crib that would soon hold only memories of a daddy who'd never see her first steps or hear her first words. Wayne had his back to the door when Daniel entered, humming along to classic rock on a paint-splattered radio, completely absorbed in the delicate work of adjusting carburetor settings. Tools scattered across the workbench, parts cataloged and organized with the obsessive precision of a man who took pride in quality work even when nobody was watching. He turned when footsteps approached, wrench in his hand, and saw Daniel standing there like death personified. Wayne's smile died on his lips as recognition dawned, as understanding flooded through him like ice water, as he realized that family arguments had escalated beyond words and threats into something that would end with violence and blood. Oh God. Oh Jesus, no. Wayne dropped the wrench, metal clanging on concrete, the sound echoing through the garage like a bell tolling for the dead. "Daniel, please. I got a baby, 8 months old, little girl named Emma. She's everything to me." "I know," Daniel said. And he did. Had seen the baby at the grocery store just 2 weeks earlier. Cute kid with her father's red hair and her mother's blue eyes, held proudly by parents who thought the future held nothing but promise and possibility. Then how can you do this? How can you take her daddy away for something I had nothing to do with? "Because this is bigger than one baby," Daniel replied, his voice carrying the weight of principles that seemed more important than individual lives when viewed through the lens of mountain honor. "This is about my family, my sons, my legacy. You Garretts took that from me when you stole what kept us fed. The Turner Massacre stands as one of the darkest chapters in Appalachian history, a testament to what happens when desperation meets ancient codes of honor in forgotten places, where law carries less weight than tradition. 14 men died that October night because one family believed theft of livelihood deserved death, and another family made the fatal mistake of crossing people who had nothing left to lose except their pride. Daniel Turner got his revenge, but the price was everything he'd tried to protect. His sons scattered to federal prisons, his legacy became synonymous with violence, and the mountain codes he'd died to uphold crumbled under the weight of 14 graves. Sometimes the cure becomes deadlier than the disease. and justice transforms into something unrecognizable from what we thought we were fighting for. If this story made you think about desperation, honor, and the terrible mathematics of mountain justice, leave your like and subscribe for more true stories that challenge everything we think we know about right and wrong in America's forgotten corners.